Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and Encanto is a fascinating movie, both for what's familiar about it and for what's unique. As a flowing, high-energy, and highly visual story, it heavily relishes in the Colombian culture and values its setting is based on, but it also carries with it a challenge to some of those same ideas in ways that fit cleanly alongside the recent trajectory of Disney animation. So, in my exceedingly slow push to get more film reviews on this channel of mine, I wanted to discuss the areas of this film that really stuck out to me. The first and most obvious observation is how much detail and attention was paid to animating the world of Encanto. Even though the production team could never quite get the full experience of Colombia, their research and cultural consultants made sure that most of the visual cues were ones that those privy to this culture could be expected to latch onto. They spoke of creating a timeless and inviting feel for Encanto, using inspiration from some of the larger cities like the capital of Bogota to smaller but just as picturesque towns like Salento. Now, I'm not Colombian myself, of course, so there's plenty of folks who could speak with actual authority on the matter, but there was honestly a larger push for at least some semblance of authenticity compared to what we've come to expect out of Disney. And there is an entire conversation to be had about Disney's everlasting march to make you forget that Song of the South and Pocahontas were high-budget acts of historical vandalism. And that always makes me a bit hesitant to praise them too much when their ideas of progressiveness and self-reference almost always come off as extremely hollow, which would be especially true for anyone who isn't seeing a movie like this for the first time. But as we'll dig into, I don't think it was nearly as tacky here. The music of Encanto is easily one of its most definitive traits. For better or worse, depending on where your opinion of Lin-Manuel Miranda falls, the overall pace and layering of the soundtrack here makes his unique fingerprints readily perceptible in nearly every song, but especially in crowd favorite We Don't Talk About Bruno, which we will, soon enough, talk about. I like Moana as much as most, but even my favorite song from that soundtrack comes off as one that most Disney musicians could write to me. But it wouldn't surprise me if Miranda's impossibly high stature as the go-to music guy over the last few years increased the amount of creative control he had in this project. Because even on just a first listen, his style very much pervades the soundscape. Digging a bit more into the meat of Encanto, the basic plot is that Mirabel is the one non-married member of the magical family to supposedly be rejected by the miracle candle and, as such, struggles with not having a gift and, by extension, not really having a designated place in said family. Which gives us a unique and unseen antagonist in this film, that being the toxic, anxiety-promoting familial standards which already caused the estrangement of one family member and was well on its way to estranging another. Not having literal superpowers is a very simple, yet very effective metaphor for not quite being able to find your place in a system of family expectations. But the movie wisely informs us that having expectations can be just as psychologically damaging as the opposite, if not more so in some cases. This emphasis on tearing apart at the seams due to the need to carry literal or figurative weight for the sake of family becomes that much more interesting when juxtaposed against the potentially numerous historical reference points the film uses. Digging into Abuela's origins as the matriarch of the family gives us a mostly shrouded backdrop of the destruction of her old home. It doesn't dig quite as deeply as a kids' movie would ever be allowed to, of course, but it matters that there was at least some attention paid to the long and storied socio- and geopolitical strife of a nation that is still very much feeling the impact of events from well over a century ago. And before I go any further, I welcome any and all Colombians, Latin Americans, or just people with historical knowledge to add on to or correct me on anything I may miss or misinterpret here. This will not be the full coverage such a topic warrants, so that input will honestly be more valuable than my own. So, after winning independence, the nation of Colombia struggled mightily with what type of government should be in place, and with that struggle came numerous civil wars, some of which aren't even officially recognized but nonetheless costed lives, due primarily to divergent political ideologies. all leading up to around the turn of the century and the Thousand Days' War. The repercussions of said war included the loss of Panama, economic devastation, and the rise in guerrilla warfare that the film showcases to an extent that has killed and displaced millions of Colombians over the last century and change. To say nothing of the more mid-20th century events, including the United Fruit Company massacres, the rise and subsequent murder of the popular political leader Jorge Gaitan, leading to the Bogotazo, and the period of La Violencia immediately after that. The rage, the strife, the displacement, all of this is still very much happening today, and is the biggest reason most casual observers only know Colombia as the country where violence happens. For as interesting and powerful as those bits of history are, the full intricacies involved could take an entire semester or more to properly unravel. But I do encourage those who like this movie to research further, because it's a lot, especially the mid-century stuff. But I also think it's very important to understand Encanto as a story predicated on historical facts and the darker aspects thereof, in addition to the colorful vibrancy most of the runtime provides, because no country should be defined as exclusively the sooner or the latter. But the important bit that I think carries into Encanto's overall narrative is that the familial strife here, represented literally by a broken home and a displaced uncle before that, feels a lot more lived in and tangible for that reason. So when we think of an overemphasis on tradition and the rigid, absolutist ideas of family, we see that characterized in a matriarch who has known no other viable way of life. A matriarch who is understandably desperate to hold on tight, because a lot of people she knew never had the chance to. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that she fully expects her next of kin to embody that same sense of traditional marriage, having more kids, giving them their own magic door, mostly standard family stuff. It's a very conservative point of view, both socially and politically, but it's from that perspective where the final bits really hit home, pun somewhat intended. Because what we see is how that mentality can breed internal conflict, leading to both internal and external destruction, and almost ends with losing everything one has tried to build again. But the hopeful outlook showcased here is that through mutual understanding, through the knowledge of how our past shapes our present, that even heavily divergent perspectives can coalesce and rebuild, and that even those thought lost can find their way back into our lives. Mirabel saved her family because she challenges what it means to be family, and all of that is seamlessly symbolized by way of her door, and one could argue gift, being the casita itself. So my biggest sense of appreciation for Encanto, even from a very not Colombian perspective, is how it navigates the elements that inform the basis of the conflict, even while only being able to convey so much about said elements, as are the limitations of not just Disney's specific stranglehold over media, but also the apparent lack of much actual Colombian representation on the production team, beyond the cultural consultants they acquired. But thinking about it from a more Disney-fied perspective lends the movie to an interesting evolution of how their modern-day animated films have handled the concept of family. Both the most interesting and most incomplete story beat in the original Frozen is how the failings of parental guidance led Anna and Elsa to an estranged youth, where both were being forcibly concealed in one way or another. But we never quite get a resolution that feels like it acknowledges those feelings, since Frozen 2 veers backwards in a great many respects. But then, when we think about Moana, our lead is only able to achieve her destiny after being firmly informed of how unfair it was that generational responsibility was forced upon her at all. On that front at least, it's a step in the right direction. And here, Encanto's story largely revolves around those two comparable enough ideas moving more into the foreground, so instead of only being an implication or part of a resolution that still needs to end with a destiny fulfilled, it's the emotional catharsis the entire script builds up to. This point isn't meant to draw a correlation with overall quality, because that's a much different discussion, one that the internet has already thoroughly ruined, and that's without bringing up Tangled. But it is to say that there are certain trends that Disney Animation has been keying in on during this generation of films, and it's interesting to see how they've seemingly become more aware of it over time, but not in the fourth wall breaking sense, for once. but it also does make me wish the runtime didn't limit how much self-actualization was present in proceedings. I really enjoyed how Luisa and Isabella's seamless senses of self were pushed and forced to evolve, as they confronted parts about themselves and their lives that scared them. But it's also odd to me that Camilo, being a shapeshifter, and as such, not really having an identity, wasn't more of a focal point. In many respects, he's just as in the dark about who he's supposed to be relative to who he's meant to be as Mirabel, so part of me wonders if there was a version of the script that leaned into that a little bit more, or leaned into how the fathers here maybe needed to navigate an atmosphere of not quite feeling on par with the family standard, especially when Abuela's point of comparison is her heroic, self-sacrificing husband. You would think Mirabel's father especially would be able to empathize with her plight to some degree, but his primary role in this movie is bee-sting victim, I guess. A 90-minute movie can't hope to cover all of this ground while also feeling focused enough for the target audience. I get that. These points are more tangential than anything, but they came into my head specifically because of We Don't Talk About Bruno, which I liked as a musical number because it really highlighted a lot of family members that otherwise wouldn't have registered at all. Like how Dolores, by way of her powers, is forced to bear the emotional brunt of Bruno's trauma, or how detailed and somewhat accurate Camilo's descriptions of him are, even though he would know the least about his uncle compared to everyone else singing. It's just a handful of implications for a pair of relatively minor characters, the latter of which is more incidental than the sooner, but they intrigued me because even without much of a spotlight, those characters felt more like people and not as much like one-note gimmicks to round out the superfamily, and fittingly, that came about because they did, in fact, talk about Bruno. In closing, I enjoyed Encanto quite a bit. It's everything we've come to expect from Disney animation for better and for worse, but leaning well into better. But it is a Disney flick at the end of the day, so at best, it's a good starting point for those looking for a deeper, more nuanced dive into the cultural and historical elements both utilized and alluded to here. But for what it is, it's a really fun time with a well-delivered message and some really great performances from the voice actors as well as the musicians and animators who brought everything to life. And as always, let me know what you thought down below. And do the whole like and share the video thing so I can hopefully do more film reviews down the line. It would honestly mean a lot if this popped off and then we could talk about, I don't know, Frozen 2? It's messy, but it presents a chance to have a neat conversation on a lot of different topics. So, until then, thanks for watching.